collegefootballnerds.com. Going to discuss an 8-team playoff in college football and why we both think that's a bad idea. We'll kind of let the merits of it breathe a little bit, but also tell you why we don't think it's a great idea. And we're not here to talk trash. If you're on the 8-team bandwagon, that's great. We're not. So we're going to talk about it. Josh, let's get into this. But before we do, please remember, if you haven't seen anything we've done this year, or if you have and you kind of shied away, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments why we're crazy. Maybe let us know on Twitter too, whatever. We'll talk about it. Josh, this thing kind of blew up. I think it was a Stuart Mandel piece on The Athletic earlier this week, talking about how there's a groundswell of presidents and ADs that are saying we need to move to an 8-team playoff. You and I both don't love this idea. And for me, the frustrating point is there's a lot of things that frustrate me about it. But the concern I have is it seems like the people that are for it because they are, commissioners of a league or athletic directors of a team that got left out. And all the quotes I saw this year or this week were, we've got conferences like the Big Ten, that's an important conference, and they're getting left out. That to me is not a reason for expansion, especially when it's just a surface level look at why they got left out. Big Ten, yes, is a very important conference, but Ohio State, your champion, lost by 29 points to Purdue. Nobody ever talks about that. Nobody ever talks about why they got left out. Last year, they got left out because they lost 2 games, one of which 31 points to Iowa. Michigan, had they beaten Ohio State, Michigan would have probably been ahead. There was some discussion about maybe being ahead of Notre Dame. They would have definitely been in the playoffs. So you're not getting left out because of some bias. You're getting left out because of results on the field. So I want you to talk about that. And I want you to talk about the concept that it devalues the regular season. My point there is, if we went to 8 with auto bids, this year we would have a 3-loss Washington team on equal footing with Alabama. And to me, that is ridiculous. We don't need, and by the way, 3 losses to unranked teams, one of which Alabama beat 52-21. We don't need them to play another game to show that Alabama is better than them. Everybody says this is an opinion thing. It's an invitational. There are some things that are objectively kind of true that we can see with our own eyes. Alabama's better than Washington this year. It's not a slide in the Pac-12. It just is the case. So does an 8-team devalue the regular season? And are these conference commissioners kind of complaining, and they shouldn't be?
So the first point I'll make with this is last year's Alabama-Ohio State controversy. Because I think, obviously, there was always a group that wanted us to go to 8 teams. There was a very vocal part of the media that always said this should go to 8 teams and that 4 was too few. 2017, Alabama's 4, Ohio State's 5. And there's an outcry because Ohio State wins the conference, Alabama does not. And the whole discussion there, one, there were multiple factors. Alabama, if Alabama had been a conference champion, there would have been no discussion there whatsoever. But Ohio State had 2 losses, one of which was to an unranked team by 31 points. Alabama did not win their division. And you had to balance how much is having 2 losses versus 1 and having a blowout unranked loss versus another. That was the whole focus of the debate, though. The thing that I think got lost in that whole discussion to me has always been, in my view, neither Alabama nor Ohio State deserved to be in the playoff in 2017. They both on the field lost the right, really, to play for the championship game. But we have to take 4 teams, so we had to draw a line, and you had to choose who you wanted to pick between Alabama and Ohio State. When we talk about that discussion and we see how unfair it is to Ohio State that the Big Ten gets left out in 2017, so 2 SEC teams get in, I think that the part that's missed is it's unfair to number 5 who didn't deserve to be in because they didn't get in over number 4 who didn't deserve to be in. So let's just take both teams that didn't deserve to be in. That's the argument? I think that's the first mistake, that we are falling victim to the fact that no matter where you draw the line, there's always somebody that arguably gets shafted versus that didn't make it versus somebody that did. So that would be my first point. The second point is the last 3 years, 18, 17, and 16, there has been a 3-loss team that would make the playoff. And you talked about this year, it'd be, if it's Washington, if it's last year, Auburn with 3 losses is number 7. 2016, Wisconsin was number 8 with 3 losses. I don't think you ever want a 3-loss team. If you have 3 losses in college football, you don't deserve to play for a national title, in my opinion. So, to me, I think that aspect of it too is pretty ridiculous. That if you're put them together here, right? The complaint is, if your complaint is that Alabama shouldn't have been in 2017 because they didn't win their division, and how ridiculous it was that Ohio State didn't be in. That to me is an explanation for why going to 14, the disadvantage to going to 4. It's not a reason to going to 8. And what we're going to do now is we're going to make it where winning your conference isn't even really a big deal. It's very easy to make the playoff without winning your conference. So it definitely devalues the regular season because, again, Auburn, who drops 2 games in the regular season and loses the conference championship game, would have gotten in 2017 in an 8-team structure the way it's currently built. I don't like that. I don't agree with it. And we can get into this in a minute. I think maybe there's an argument for 6, but I certainly don't think there's an argument for the top 8. And I think it gets worse if you bring in the angle of conference champions being in automatically. I have a hard time, we can talk about top 6 and that's a different discussion, but the top 8 thing, no matter how you want to slice it, just doesn't work in my view.
Yeah, and a lot of this discussion comes from people in NFL markets who are used to the NFL, and that's the number one comment I've seen on Twitter. Well, every level of sport gets it right, and NFL can do it. And then I tweeted yesterday, going into the game yesterday before the Browns won, they were 5-7-1. They won the game, and now they're in playoff contention. That is, first of all, that's ridiculous. Second of all, there's a level of parity in the NFL with just 32 teams that we do not have in college football. You talk about adding a 3-loss team and them probably not belonging. Every year in the playoffs, because we have to take 4 teams, there's always been at least one team that had no business being in the playoffs. We don't have enough parity for 8 teams, 10 teams to be good enough to play with the top 1 to 3 teams in the postseason on the line for national championship. Look at last year, Clemson got blown out. Ohio State lost 31-0. Florida State and Oregon had no business in 2014 being in there. Michigan State got blown out. So, and it's funny because the Big Ten complains about not getting in, but the last two teams they did put in got blanked, like 65-0 combined score. So I think when we're looking at this from an NFL standpoint, there's a ton of parity, worst team to best team in the NFL. That's why you can go 10-6 or whatever, have a worthless, essentially, regular season and still make the playoffs. We're not getting enough good teams with 4, and now we want to expand it to 8? That's crazy to me.
And I think that point's well taken because and this does get to your point with other sports. Like college basketball, something gets brought up a lot. Basketball is a completely different sport than football. Any team can win on any given day, and to a certain extent, you have some Cinderella stories, and everybody sort of loves that. Well, the problem with that is in basketball, upsets happen a lot because it's such an emotionally driven sport. It doesn't really happen.
No, and to your point about basketball, there's 5 players on the floor that matter. You can have one elite player come in and change the dynamic because he makes up 20% of the team. That's why, a low-level program like Gonzaga can be successful, Butler can be successful, because they have to coach up and recruit 1 or 2 guys that can make their entire team. You put one elite player on Rutgers this year, they have the same record.
Yeah. And to a lot of people, that's an argument of, well, then it shouldn't be a problem to go to 8 because the top teams will win anyway. But if your argument then becomes, well, the top teams will win anyway.
Why are we doing it?
Why are we doing it, right? If your argument is just that we need to give these teams an extra game to play before they can play the real playoff, then that's just, to me, that's just stupid. You only want to expand to 8 if you actually think there are 8 deserving teams or 8 teams that should win. If it's not, you don't want it to be a true fluke that 5 through 8 win.
And I think this comes from fans not looking at this objectively and saying, we got left out because of bias. And if we were in there, we would win. And I just don't agree with that. Because again, look, we've had 4. We've had 4 in, and never have we had 4 that were worthy. 8, we will never have 8 that are worthy. And it's not bias. If you auto bid and put Washington in to play Alabama in the first round, Alabama would drill Washington. Again, we have a common opponent. We have 3 unlosses. I don't want to reward a regular season that has no top 10 wins, 3 unranked losses, to be on equal footing with Alabama in round 1 of the playoffs. And the reward Alabama gets for going 13-0, having the most dominant history in college football history regular season, is they get to play a team that went 10-3, didn't beat anybody really that mattered on an elite scale, only to see Tua, because God knows he's going to get hurt, only to see Tua or somebody else get hurt in that opening round game that they would otherwise drill them, win 28-17, and then lose the playoffs against a team that belonged there because now they're without their quarterback or they're without their running back or whatever.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of an overarching point, right? You're asking the number people. I heard that argument recently from someone. Well, they play Washington. Washington's not that good. Okay, well, so they play Washington. So you're making them play an extra game before they have to play another game before they can play for the championship. You're just throwing an extra obstacle in their way for another opportunities to be hurt or get banged up. Another game where they're probably, maybe they're not as motivated as they need to be, et cetera, et cetera. It just, I don't know. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, and talk about this too, because everybody says, okay, you got to auto bid with 8 because, look, win your conference. That's how we decide the NFL. You win your conference, you're in the playoffs. Win your conference in college football. Even if they go to 8, I think auto bids are silly because this notion that all conferences are created equal, and right now the SEC is the best, but do we honestly think that there aren't 4 teams in the SEC that couldn't have won the Pac-12 this year? That if Clemson didn't happen to be as good as they are this year, that there aren't 3 teams in... Look, there was a division winner in the ACC that lost 51-6 to Penn State. I don't want that team to be in the playoffs. And everybody says, well, you're talking about edge cases. If Pitt beat Clemson or if Northwestern beat Ohio State. First of all, those edge cases have happened. And second of all, we have an example this year. I hate to harp on Washington because I love Peterson and I love that program. But that's a team that is the edge case. They're 10-3 with a crappy season, in my opinion, as it relates to playing for a championship. All conferences are not created equal. And people say, well, now you're leaving it up to an invitational and it's subjectivity. At some level, we still have to use subjectivity because nobody's saying that UAB needs an auto bid. And you roll your eyes and say, oh, well, that's a G5 team. They won a G5 conference. How do you know? How do you know that the G5 winner, because honestly, Central Florida with a healthy McKenzie Milton probably wins the Pac-12 this year. So at some level, you have to use subjectivity unless we want to have a 130-team playoff. Am I wrong in saying that?
I don't. I don't think you're wrong. I mean, last year was kind of fascinating to me that going into the playoff, UCF was 12th. I mean, they weren't even top 8, and it's just so difficult, I think, to get across to people that aren't familiar with college football and how it works, how uneven conferences can be. To your point, Washington wins the Pac-12. Auburn, who's at best, it's a multi-way tie, but at best was 5th in the SEC, beat Washington in the opener. And it wasn't a fluke game. I don't know why Washington... It's almost a stretch, honestly, this year that where some of the teams are ranked where they are, because you kind of feel like the playoff committee is going really heavily. If you look at it, it's pretty much win-loss record first and foremost, and then everything else is a slight tweak off that. I don't know why UCF. I mean, there's a reason UCF's ranked ahead of Washington with 12-0, but in past years, I don't know that they get there. UCF is kind of a unique thing. I don't know. I think a lot of this at the end of the day really boils down to one simple factor. We've seen the same teams repeatedly in the playoff, and people want to see more variety. We've seen UCF get left out for 2 years when they went undefeated, and people feel like an undefeated team should make the playoff because they're undefeated. And they view it from an NFL or professional lens where they feel like there's parity. If you're undefeated, you should be in. If we don't want to see the same teams every year, and it's really you've got fans of certain groups like UCF fans that are upset that they go undefeated and feel like they're not given a shot despite what they've, quote, done what they needed to do. When the problem with UCF, with their schedule being as weak as it is, because it's like they're playing a totally different sport almost. It's like they're in they're an FBS team. Their schedule has zero overlap with any Power 5 team. They needed to blow everybody out, and they would have been in the discussion. And they keep having one-score wins over very bad teams. Their best win is over a Memphis team
that Missouri had like 48
right?
points in the first half on.
Right. Missouri beat them handily. That's the issue here. First, with you can always earn your way on the field if you do what you're supposed to, and you're a Power 5 team, you'll get in. And if you're a Group of 5 team and you really prove it, you'll get in. And then the second thing is I think you have a lot of people that are, honestly, they're maybe NFL fans, or they watch college football as a secondary sport, and they're just kind of tired of seeing the same teams at the end of the year. They're the fans that watch, they're the fans that watch March Madness but don't watch the rest of the basketball season, right? And they want to see that kind of craziness in college football. They don't really understand the sport. They don't really follow teams closely, and they're not an Ohio State fan that. And I think a lot of the blue bloods from the interactions we have, they kind of understand, like Michigan fans, hey, we had a shot on the field and we didn't earn it. And if we were going to be in the playoff, we needed to earn that spot and we didn't do it. And they just want to see teams thrown down. They feel like they'll get this crazy fun thing like they get with March Madness, and they won't. What they're going to end up with is mostly blowouts and then occasionally a fluke win due to injury or something that's going to sort of compromise the integrity of the playoffs otherwise.
Yeah, and Big Ten fans, specifically Ohio State fans, that are the most upset about it. And I get it. It's frustrating. It's frustrating to win your conference and not have a shot at the playoffs. But look at Michigan as an example this year, because you say it won't devalue the regular season, which by far, college football, best regular season in sports, because so much is on the line every week. You say it won't devalue the regular season. Michigan just lost 158-2 in their last game to Ohio State and would have comfortably been in the playoffs this year. You telling me that doesn't matter? That doesn't devalue the regular season? Absolutely it does. They were not competitive in that game. They lost the two teams they played this year who mattered. The rest of their schedule didn't matter. They had one other decent game against Penn State. They lost. They went 0-2 against good teams. You're telling me that doesn't matter? Next year, Ohio State will play their first ranked game November 23rd. Their season is a 2-game season. They could theoretically lose both of those games and still make the playoffs under an auto bid situation. That's crazy to me. And I'm not picking on them, because if the Big Ten was dominant and the SEC was getting left out, the SEC fans would be saying the same thing, because it's always bias. It's easy to call bias, and it's human nature. But I honestly, I feel like the people that are getting the shortest end of the stick here are probably the G5 teams because of what's going on with UCF. So my solution, maybe you can let this one breathe a little bit. My solution is 6 teams, no auto bids, first 2 get a bye, play them on college campuses. Tell me what you think.
So I am kind of with you on that one. And I made the point of the past 3 years that you end up, most of the solutions everyone has, this auto bid, conference champion 8-team playoff, you end up with a 3-win team each of the past 3 years. That's why you can't go to 8. It's because of the number of teams in college football that are actually worthy of being in the playoff doesn't support 8. I think you can make an argument for 6. I prefer 4 personally, but I can get behind 6. And the biggest reason I can get behind it is under the current system, I think it is almost impossible for a G5 to get in the top 4. Unless you are a Boise State where you're playing a top 10 team every year and you've got to schedule that out years in advance and hope that they're a top 10 in the year where you're a phenomenal team and you scheduled that 5 years ago, you're never going to get in. You just, it's too unlikely to not have 4 one-loss or fewer Power 5 champions or somebody like an Alabama that's 1 loss and was dominant otherwise for the rest of the year. And you're not going to get in over a team like that. When you go to 6, like this year, it would capture Georgia, who had a very good season and had a very, very strong case for being probably. I know under most every advanced metric, they're actually the 3rd best team in the country. But they lost 2 games because they had a bad day on the road in one of the most hostile environments at LSU, and should be punished for it, which is why they're not in the playoff, which I agree with under the current structure. And they lost to Alabama in a very close game that they were winning for much of the game, which I don't know that they really should be punished for. Georgia and Ohio State get in this year. UCF does not get in, which I think is fair, honestly, because I don't think UCF dominated their competition week in and week out in not just a bad schedule, but a ridiculously poor schedule. I think that's reasonable. And if you're in a situation where a group of 5 team really does, plays 1 or 2 Power 5 teams that are pretty good, beats them up pretty solidly, really dominates the rest of the schedule, you can get in 6 teams. That solves the Alabama-Ohio State quandary last year, though I note that it actually puts Wisconsin in the playoff in 2017, which is its own problem. 2016, you end up with Penn State and Michigan, so that Ohio State-Penn State thing gonna get solved on itself. So it deals with some various problems. I think most years you get teams that really aren't terribly deserving, but it does sort of deal with some arguments, and it allows for if all 5 Power Conference champions were undefeated, they can't all get in right now. I think that is in and of itself a problem. I think the G5 thing's a problem. The last thing I'll say on this, though, is to your point with the college stadiums, and I hear this a lot, that they got to play in college campuses. I will say I don't think that ever happens. And the biggest reason I think that never happens, that they want to say you have the play-in game on a college campus, it's the number 1 and the number 2 teams in the playoff are going to be up in arms that number 3 and number 4 get this home game with local home game revenue, even if the playoff committee gets all the revenue from it, which they won't under that structure, and that's the other reason the NCAA won't allow it. They're going to be up in arms just that that they get to host a game and have all this stuff on campus, and they get there's benefits from that, probably from recruiting, but there's also going to be a lot of monetary benefits for the community. And number 1 and number 2 don't get to host that because they're number 1 and number 2 and not number 3 and number 4. I think if they went to the play-in scenario, the play-ins themselves are going to be bowls. It's just going to be bowls due to the politics involved and everything going on, unless they moved everything to college campus. But I do think it would be pretty great, in this period. No SEC team plays this year until the 27th of December. It'd be pretty nice, like on the 23rd, if we could have a couple playoff games to kind of get bowl season started and have some fun stuff. And not have them all squeezed in into the month of, the end of December or the start of January.
That's a good point, because there are like New Year's Six bowls that happen after the playoffs this year. So there is interest after the first round of the playoffs in other bowl games. To me, the auto bid thing boils down to this. And tell me if I'm wrong in thinking this. When you say all conference champions should automatically get a lock, or when you say, because this is Joel Klatt's big thing, is if you don't win your conference, you have no business in the playoffs. What you're effectively saying is that for a fact the second best team in a conference in any given year could in no way have won a conference if they were not in that conference. You're saying, Joel Klatt, that 10-3 Washington has more rights to the playoff because they won their arbitrary geographical conference when Georgia would probably beat them by 3 touchdowns. You're saying that Washington has more rights to it than that. What you're saying is second place in a conference couldn't win another conference. You got to be saying that, right?
I think that's part of it, but I think the bigger thing from people that make that argument is they feel like there's a certain amount of fairness that every conference has to get its own shot. As if a conference is its own thing, right? That it's like its own team that gets to play against other conferences. You don't put a conference in the playoffs. You put a team in the playoffs. And some teams are more deserving than others. And I'll make another point that this is actually one of the big issues with the auto bid concept. If you auto bid, you render major non-conference games pointless.
True.
Because if you win your conference, you get in. It doesn't matter if your Northwestern went 0-3 in non-conference play this year. But if they won the championship for the Big Ten, they get in anyway. You know, Ohio, it was important that Baker Mayfield beat Ohio State last year. Right. You render that game completely meaningless because all that matters is your conference record. So if you go in the auto bid scenario, it truly renders non-conference play completely meaningless for the playoff discussion, with the exception of and a lot of the proposals I've read was the 5 Power 5 conference champions, the top G5 team, and 2 wild cards. So the only time it matters is if you're a wild card, and nobody's going to really play for that. So at that point, because you're jockeying for bowl position anyway, and you're jockeying for trying to make sure that you're going to be bowl eligible every year, nobody is ever going to freaking play a meaningful non-conference game because all they can do is hurt you. They can't help you get into the playoffs because you got to win your conference anyway. It would render non-conference games absolutely meaningless.
And nobody would play them because all you're going to do is set yourself up to try to win your conference. Nobody is going to schedule in the hopes of having a really strong schedule to get that wild card spot, like you said. So that really, I think we've done a pretty good job of laying out how it dilutes the regular season, which is the best regular season in sports. If you do move to 6, it is a reward for the top 2 teams that have had the best year because they don't have to play in that opening round. So if you move to 6, you can have a path for all Power 5 conferences to get their champion in. Still don't auto bid, but it still keeps the regular season very much important because in this 6 scenario, Washington wouldn't get in. But had they beaten Auburn, or had they not lost to Cal or Oregon, maybe they do.
Yeah, I agree. And Alabama and Clemson get a first round bye as a reward for going undefeated against a very tough in Alabama's case a tough schedule dominantly, and in Clemson's case a decent schedule but in an absolutely dominant fashion.
Yeah, and
with major non-conference games.
Yeah, and that's how you avoid having someone who had an okay season back their way into the playoffs from being on equal footing with an Alabama or Clemson. That's how you reward somebody that is, far and away better in their season on the field, and it does become a combination of resume, accomplishment, and eye test and all that. All right, we went longer on this one than we thought we would, which is what we always do. So anything else on this one before we close it out?
I don't think so. I do think whatever discussion we have, I don't know that it's going to be very meaningful. And the politics, if they get to the point of doing this between the different conferences, it's going to be nuts. And it's going to create a tremendous amount of animosity because you're going to have the conferences like the Big Ten that aren't getting in, pushing hard to do it just so they can have their team a participant in the playoffs. And it's at the end of the day, I think what it would do is, we talk about this a lot, the 9-game conference slate, what it has really done in college football is it's isolated conferences more than they ever were. Teams don't play a lot of major out-of-conference games anymore. Bowl season is getting extremely difficult for us to judge teams because it's almost like they play, it's almost like you're judging a team in Mississippi high school football team against a Montana high school football team where everything about the caliber of player or what they're doing is different. There's no intersection. And if they move to this format, it's just going to encourage them to silo themselves even more, where now you're even more focused on winning your own conference. And especially if you go to 8 teams, even if you're not an automatic bid, winning your conference is probably almost always going to get you in. And you just don't want to take unnecessary losses. You want to make sure that you can win the conference with 2 losses or less because you're going to make the playoff. We're not going to get meaningful out-of-conference games, and it's going to be kind of a shame to me because we're going to lose the national nature of college football, and it's going to be entirely regional.
All right, y'all. You heard it from us. We don't love the 8-team playoff concept, but we would love to hear you discuss in the comments why you think we're wrong, why you think we're crazy, or if you happen to agree with us. I'm sure some of you, maybe a few of you will. So let us know in the comments. We'll get after it in there. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.